going to move on. Perdigons are a really big staple of my fishing right now, for a reason. The Spaniards who came up with them, they've been world champions and medalists 3 times out of the last 3 years, and guess what they fish most of the time? They fish a lot of Perdigons, and they work really well. But we're going to switch gears and go almost totally opposite. This is a big favorite of mine. I fish this fly. You know, if someone came to me and said, you know, what's like 3 flies you couldn't live without if you're going around? I get that question all the time, and as a fly tyer, it drives you nuts, right? Because you can't do that. There's no point in that. Part of the fun is the variety. But if I had to go to a new river somewhere on the planet, and I had 3 flies that were going to come out of my box first, this is one of those 3 flies that would come out of my box first. It looks like absolutely nothing in nature, but it's one of those attractor patterns that, for whatever reason, the fish just love. And we think of, you know, the Provo and most of the other tailwaters around here as techie places where you got to fish tiny little imitative flies. That's the only way to catch a fish. And I catch a lot of fish on this fly on the Provo. So, all right, so I've got another inverting bead here. In fact, before I forget, let's do one of those just so you can see what we do. So I can placate Mr. Rowley here in the front row. So this is the size 14 hook, and I've got a 3mm version of this. And if you haven't used them before, some little bead tweezers like this will make your life a lot easier if you tie a lot of beadhead style flies. They have a little recess in the tweezer. The other models I've seen have rubber tips on them to hold the bead as well, but this will keep you from launching beads across the room with hemostats or something, or sitting there trying to put little 2mm beads on your hooks all the time with your fingertips, which, unless you're my 4-year-old who has incredibly tiny fingers and a lot of dexterity, it's a little bit harder for the rest of us to do. So you can see that bead just kind of stays down if it's left to its own devices here. So yeah, you could put some lead wire in there, and I've done that in the past, but these days I'm trying to just tie my flies as thin as possible, and that means eliminating lead wire most of the time. So the easiest thing to do is just slide the bead back, put a dab of super glue on the front. You don't want to get too much or too close to the front, or else you'll get it in the hook eye. Then flip your vise upside down and slide that forward, and that should pretty much line it up on axis. What you don't want is it cocked off to the side from the hook point. You want the hook point and the bead facing opposite, or else it'll spin in the water. But as long as you do it where the hook point and the hook shank are vertical in line in the same plane, then your bead will be in this right spot. And you can always check it by looking down on it. And there, it's set. I'm just going to put it on some foam, and you'll let that cure while you're tying the rest of your flies, or just do them all at once. Now I got to remember which one I just put on the foam. There's an easy solution to that. I'll take the gold bead one and do that on the blowtorch, because I know that one's been on there.
Now is that Mechanic 430?
This is Dohiku 302. Okay. So, it doesn't really matter which thread you use on the back of this fly, because it's not going to show. We're going to switch to, actually, you know what, we'll just do this for red thread the whole way through, because there's really no need to switch. So start with some, this is 8/0 uni, you could use 16/0 Beavis, whatever you got that's red. And I'm going to lay a quick thread base, come back most of the way up. Then I have some Globe-Rite number 5, and Globe-Rite, if you've ever used fluorescent flosses, this is about the best fluorescent floss I've used. It stays true to its name. It glows really well, and it's a really famous material in the UK. They use it for all sorts of stuff on their flies over there, and I've come to love it for any sort of hotspot tag, or wherever you need a big floss or even a wide thread, like when you're tying squirmies and you don't want to bind the material down and cut it, Globe-Right works really well for that. So I've taken and cut it into 3 strips. I didn't do a very good job of getting them equal, but it doesn't matter because you're going to trim it from the other side. And normally I'll just get however much of this stuff I think I need for a dozen flies or 6 or however many I'm tying, and I'll cut it into 3, close to equal strands. Put them together, put just a couple wraps up there that are loose, and slide it back, and then you can bury it under your thread so you don't have to trim it. And I don't like to come around to where the hook is going to bend. I want to stop before the hook starts the hook bend, and then I'll actually take and use that as a measuring device so I don't make my tag too long. So I'll just slide the scissors in on that back of the hook and trim it, and now I have that nice, clean, short tag. Most of the tag nymphs that I see tied either have too long of tags or they have too much fiber. So people will stick like 4, 5, 6, 7, strands of floss in there, and then they'll make the tag twice as long. And so instead of a trigger point, it becomes overwhelming on the fly. Like you can't see anything but the tag, and I don't think they fish as well. All right, so I'm coming back up to the front, and I'm going to get some brassy diameter wire. Now this is another pattern that Umpqua picked up from me, so it'll be in the catalog next year. On the commercial version, I put a little flashback in at this point, but most of the time when I'm lazy and I really want to bang these out, I just leave that off because it's already a flashy enough fly. So you want a pretty thick wire here because this fly is going to get chewed on, and I want it to hold the dubbing down and not get broken by a fish, so that's why I'm using brassy size wire. It's going to bury into the dubbing, so it's not all that visible anyway. And then you can use any number of dubbings for this. I usually like some shade of peacock, so a peacock black ice dub is really well. I also have I grabbed this off the floor in my shop this morning because I just got a C-by order in and it was on the floor, so I put it in my pocket and I was like, I'm going to tie a blowtorch with this today. So this is dark peacock, C-by Fine Flash. Fine Flash is their version of ice dubbing, and the cool part about the C-by versions, they have about 10 shades of peacock instead of like 2, and so there's some really unique shades that I can't get in any other dubbing that I like a lot, specifically for blowtorches, but for other flies as well. And like any Angelina fiber, ice-based dubbing like this, it's pretty coarse and it dubs kind of clumpy. So just make sure you don't put on too much at a time, or else you're going to have a lumpy blowtorch. Okay, so we'll start with that, and if we can always add a little bit more if we need it, but I don't want to put too much on there and then have to take it off because that's a lot harder. So I do need a little bit more. You want to leave just a tiny gap in front of that dubbing because I'm going to tie in some hackle and a collar of dubbing. So maybe about there. In fact, we'll leave it there, and I'm going to actually put a little dubbing bump after I put in the wire. So wrap your wire forward and tie it off. And now what I want, I'm going to put some CDC hackle in here. But if I just put the CDC hackle on it and then the body is slim like this, the CDC hackle will kind of flush back along the sides, and you get more movement out of it if you can prop the fibers out a little bit perpendicular to the body, or at least closer to perpendicular. So I'm gonna put a little dubbing bump that you can kind of tie it up flush against. Okay. Now you don't want to do that before the wire, because if you put the wire in over the top, it's just going to anchor it down. So if you put that bump in afterwards, it gives it a little bit more bulbous piece of dubbing to fold around. Okay. So now I just have some natural CDC, and the great part about this CDC, I'll show you at the end what we can do here to use it for any size fly. So you look at this feather, and you think, oh my gosh, those are some pretty long fibers, but you can actually trim CDC with your fingernails so that you can make it work for any size file that you've got. But most CDC feathers, especially good like premium CDC, this is some Petitjean CDC, and I've got feathers going everywhere now. It's usually fully fibered, which is great for a dry fly when you want enough CDC out there to spread out some weight and float your fly well. But if I tie this feather in as is, it's going to make a really overdressed hackle here. So I do a couple things when I prepare this feather. I trim off the bottom and the webby stuff on both sides, and then I pick one side, and actually this side looks better, so I'm going to flip it around, and I trim up the side so that I only have one side left. And now when I make 2 or 3 turns, I get about the right amount of hackle. If I left it on, what happens with CDC a lot too, because it's so mobile and then not very stiff, you'll make a turn to tie it in, and then all the fibers will clump together on one side of the fly, and you'll get, like at your tie-in point, you'll get 30 fibers of CDC sitting there, and then the rest of it is all thin. So by trimming it off of one side of the fly, it ends up dressing it a lot better. So then I'm going to stroke the fibers back, just like that, and have a tip to tie in. And when you tie that tip in, make sure you tie it down, but then also fold the tip back and put another wrap or two in front, and that'll help lock that in. If you don't do that, that quill can slide out and drive you nuts, because usually it'll happen after you've already trimmed it and you go to make your wrap and then you have no tip to tie in with again. So you either got to grab a new feather or your quill's going to be shorter. And then I'm going to use the rotary function again for a hackle. So put your whip finish in and put your bobbin on the cradle, and then just some basic hackle pliers here work just fine. Go ahead and get it started, and right about 2 turns to maybe 3 depending upon the feather. And there again, you look at those fibers and they look really long, and they are, but we're going to fix them in just a second. But first, before we do that, we are going to put a little collar in. So if you're familiar with Lance Egan's red dart, this has really similar color schemes. When we fish together, if he fishes a red dart, I fish a blowtorch, and if I fish a blowtorch, he fishes a red dart. So I just like the tag on it a little more than the red hackle, and then I have CDC instead of chicken hackle or hen hackle. But this little UV pink ice dub hotspot up front is a common theme on both of them. So you want just a little bit, enough to make a collar, but not so much that it's overwhelming. You also don't want to put it such a big collar that it pushes that hackle back against the body again. So if you put too much dubbing on there, then it overwhelms that dubbing bump you put behind the CDC and will push it back. All right, so then whenever I finish flies that aren't covered in resin, I will take some super glue and put it on the thread, just like that. Well, that's a little too much. And if you put too much and there's a bunch of drops, you can always just take the shaft of the brush and touch it, and it'll take it right back off. Then I'm going to stroke the CDC back just so I make sure I don't get any super glue on it. I make 3 or 4 wraps with that super glue, and then I come in and whip finish it. And you only need about 3 turns. And what that allows me to do, that glue being below the whip finish to begin with, the whip finish gets put over the top of the glue, and then it all binds together. So that super glue in there, this fly, it's really rare that I have a fly with the thread come off. It's got to get really beat up. I'll almost always lose the fly before the thread comes undone doing it that way. But also, by putting the super glue on before I do the whip finish, and I only have to make that 1 3-turn whip finish, so I don't have these big bulbous heads where most people put in 2, sometimes 3 whip finishes to kind of compensate, but then you get overwhelming thread and it kind of covers the back of it. So this is a cleaner way where I can do just a few wraps at the head and have that super glue to hold it all together. Now, I'm going to take the bead or the fly, pull it out of the vise, and I'm basically going to separate that hackle into 2 halves. So stroke it from the top and the bottom, and then take my thumb and my index finger here and go right to the back of that hook and just break it off flush. Then come to the top, do the same thing again. And now I have CDC hackle that's actually, some of those broke off a little bit short, but it's now at least the correct length for that hook. And the cool part is this is a size 14, but you can do this all the way down to, you know, a size 18 and still have CDC hackle that will look the correct size. But breaking it off with your thumb and your index finger that way ends up looking better than if you just took scissors and trimmed it, because then it looks flush and kind of unnatural. All right, so that's the Blowtorch, and that is a go-getter. So tie some. Thin it down? No, I mean, it's supposed to be kind of an attractor, so it doesn't need to be rail thin. I don't tie it any fatter than that, really, but yeah, it doesn't have to be, you know, micro thin.